I'd like to briefly talk about the accreditation and assessment of character formation. This is already an essence of accreditation visits. When people do visits, they ask schools about how they're going about the implementation of character formation in their community. And it's always a challenge because the moment we talk assessment of character education, we have difficulties. Who are we to assess if people are growing at various levels? And there are ways of looking at this. Some schools tend to focus on the intentional curriculum. That's good. Where within the curriculum they look to build courses that are focused on character formation. This is particularly significant for schools that are predominantly part-time, non-residential. Within the residential schools, there are often ways of building character formation into non-classroom components. In the workshop we did, we looked at three different areas. One is how do you intentionally develop courses that focus on character formation, or within courses have elements that focus on character formation. Every good school will be able to answer that question fairly easily and see that there are a whole variety of areas which are looking at character formation within their classroom-based curriculum. It's also good to ask where are there elements that are non-classroom but for which students which is compulsory for students and for which students are granted credit. Things like mentoring, chapel, small groups, the ministry practice. These are elements that are clearly forming the students but are not based in the classroom. And the third area it's good for schools to discuss are elements of the community which are clearly formational, for which there is no interest in granting credit. In our own school, we talked about having a procedure of student evaluations where a couple of times a year, students are evaluated on the basis of 4 formational areas, and students that we sense are struggling will then go through a pastoral formation process with our Dean of Students and our Student Affairs team. Other things were often where students are living in community, conflict arises. Is there a process by which those conflicts are turned into formational opportunities? These three areas of the classroom curriculum, the non-classroom components of the curriculum which are intentional, for which credit's granted, and the non-credited components are all actually important as you look at your school's character formation. We did look at some specific areas that are helpful. One of the things that is very helpful is to develop some sort of profile of an ideal leader, where you then get students to do a self-assessment several times during their journey with you as a school. And you ask them to reflect on how they see their own character formation. Self-reflections like that can also be valuable for a student dean to dialogue with the students and talk through how they see themselves and how they see their growing. There are many opportunities for this, and a good school will think intentionally in all the different features of their curriculum, both the classroom, the non-classroom curriculum, but also in the community life. As you look at specifics for how you do character education, the key is to see character formation as a growth trajectory rather than a right or wrong or an A, B or C. So building into your structures ways in which you can monitor growth and focus on growth is one of the key elements to the accreditation and assessment of character education. I mentioned the way that we do this student self-evaluations, where the students will actually be able to document their own personal growth. We also, at our school, will do this evaluation of the students themselves in terms of a growth trajectory. Do we see the students have a spirit of learning? Are they seeking to develop self-disciplines of learning and encouraging the students to do this, even as they approach graduation? For example, at our school, we run a capstone, a final 1-week intensive course with the students before graduation, part of which is to challenge students to develop a learning plan for the next 5 years. What are areas that they still want to learn and still want to grow? We also run in the second and third years of our school at ABTS an independent learning contract in which the students have to talk about areas they would like to learn. They develop a contract, they talk about what resources they want to draw on, and then they have to implement this learning contract. And for many of the students, the contract is more formational than informational. So, for example, we have students that will look at gaining control of their weight. For many students, they put on a lot of weight in their first year as their life revolves around sitting, eating, and sleeping. Now they want to get control of that, and they'll develop a learning contract through which they want to lose so many pounds of weight. And this is all part of their formational process. So as you look at developing ways of doing the assessment accreditation of character formation, think learning, think growth. Are there exercises where the students where you can develop patterns where the students themselves are instituting learning patterns for their own life? This puts them on a trajectory of lifelong learning, lifelong formation, lifelong growth. One of the questions people often ask is the granting of credit for formational components. In contemporary higher education, increasingly it has been said that any activity that is compulsory and contributes to students' learning should be granted credit at an appropriate level according to the quantity and quality. So the moment that you embed within your curriculum formational components that are compulsory, you should be granting students credit. Now this creates a problem because the students doing it because they want to grow or simply to satisfy the credit requirements? There is a whole dialogue and discourse about this. One of the things we've found helpful is you develop a cluster of formational activities. For example, we will have mentoring, involvement in chapel, small groups, and a few other involvement in student committees. We have about 4 or 5 of these activities. Each one will have credit allocations, and students have to complete a package of credits, but they get to pick or choose which elements they are going to engage with. What that does is it gives greater ownership to the students, and with the ownership comes greater commitment to the process. In terms of whether you grant grades or not, this becomes a very problematic thing because, again, can you evaluate at an ABC level the level of formation? So it can depend on the nature of what you're doing. If it is in terms of are they growing in their ability to bring quality devotionals in chapel, it could well be possible to develop a grade structure. We at our school have not, but I know of some schools that do. But it would need to be a process which is perceived as helpful and constructive rather than simply an exercise that is needed to be completed. At our own school, we can look back and see some of our great success stories. Interestingly, the area that has generated our strongest points of growth has been this evaluating students based on 4 areas of self-disciplined learning. And we had one student who simply was not responding to the pastoral care that was being given. And in the end, we suspended his studies and said, go back to your church. We have spent a long time talking with the pastor of the church, working through with the pastor of the church the areas of growth that were needed. He went back to the church for 4 years and then came back and completed the studies. And when he came back, he thanked us profoundly because he said, I now realize I needed to grow in those areas. The other one was a student who came from a majority background, had major issues, very strong personality, very difficult personality. But again, this came up very rapidly in our student assessments. We had certain areas that we gave back to our Dean of Students. He and his team worked intensely with him. He responded well and increasingly developed a learning trajectory. Now, he needed training with the Dean of Students in how to learn at a formational level. But what we saw was as our Dean of Students worked with him in the areas he needed to grow, he was having these aha moments of this is how I go about learning and growing. And in the end, we saw substantial growth in this student as he graduated.